Welcome to the cabin. Today we're painting a Night Lord's Chaos Space Marine in a metallic blue color scheme. So the model I'm using for this video is a bit of a conversion. I'm using the legs and the torso from the new Chaos Space Marine kit, as well as the shoulder pads. But the arms and the jump pack come from the Warp Talons, or Raptors boxed set. Finally, the helmet comes from the Forge World upgrade kit that they have for their Horus Heresy Night Lords. The whole model was given an undercoat of lead belcher to begin with, and this silver base is actually used for a lot of the details on this miniature. Next up, I did a zenithal highlight using the airbrush with Vallejo silver from their Game Air line. I also gave the entire model a coat of gloss varnish to help with the next step. To add some definitions to the shadows and the recesses, I used the gloss version of Nuln Oil and coated this all over the miniature, making sure it doesn't pull up too heavily. And together with the gloss surface that I just did with the varnish, this one flows really nicely into all the details. It's now that all this prep work for the silver is going to pay off. Like I said before, we're using this kind of silver color as the base for a lot of the different areas on this miniature. Starting with the power armor. I used Achillean Green, a contrast paint that weirdly enough is called green, even though it's kind of blue, and diluted this one with about 2 parts paint to 1 part contrast medium, and I washed this one all over the armor panels. If you can, try to avoid any other details, especially the metal trims. Next up, I washed all the panels with Druchii Violet. This is both to change the hue from kind of like an Alpha Legion color scheme to a darker Night Lord's color scheme, but also to take away a little bit of that metal shine. I don't want it to be too metallic once this is done. Finally, to add some easy chipping and scratches, I use a sponge to add some Runefang steel damage to the armor panels. Any overspill is then cleaned up with silver paint on the metal trims, for example, or the cables. And instead of base coating the trims, which could be quite the chore, I'm again using a contrast paint over the silver, this time Gorgrunta Fur, which I diluted a bit more, maybe about 2 parts contrast medium to 1 part paint. The pigment is quite heavy in this paint, so it really pays off to dilute this one a bit, and instead do maybe 2 coats to cover all the trims. Next up, we have the armor seals, and again we're taking advantage of that silver base that we put down. And pretty much all that I'm doing here is adding Basilicanum Grey straight from the pot to cover all the seals. By this point we have the armor, the trims, all the silver parts, and the armor seals complete, and it's all based on that silver base coat that we did before. So a lot of the model is done. Right now it's just down to some additional details, really. All of the holsters were base coated in Abaddon Black. And then I just add a simple edge highlight of Dawnstone to make them stand out just a little bit more. These newer models always have some leather straps on them, and I base coat these areas with Steel Legion Drab. Followed by a wash of Agrax Earthshade. Once the wash is dry, I do an edge highlight of Zandri Dust. And finally, to bring it all together and change the hue a little bit, I do another wash of Reichsland Fleshshade all over these areas. Next up, I started working on the skulls and the bones featuring on the miniature. I base coated all of these areas with Wraithbone. And then I added Skeleton Horde straight from the pot all over the area. I also do a selective wash of Agrax Earthshade on the very deepest parts of the skulls. At this point, I took a break from the skulls and I actually painted in all the eye lenses. This is to make it easier if I make any mistakes, so that I could clean up the bones before having finished them entirely. I paint the eye lenses with a base coat of Abaddon Black. And then using a very small brush, I add a dot of Pallid Witch Flesh towards the back of the lens. After this, Wastaka Red is layered on towards the front. And finally, a highlight of Trollslayer Orange is applied to the very front of the lens. After having cleaned up any overspill from the eye lenses, I go back to the bones and I add a first highlight of Screaming Skull. Finally, I do an edge highlight of Wraithbone on the highest of the raised surfaces. I wanted to keep the bases quite simple to not detract too much from the miniature, and also, because I am a Night Lords fan, I wanted to base them around the planet of Tsagualsa, which is described as having these massive deserts of black mica and midnight rock. I applied some slate rock and some sand on the bases using PVA glue, and then I undercoated them with Chaos Black. In order to bring out some of these details, I started with a dry brush of Eshin Grey. Followed by another layer of dry brushing, this time using Dawnstone. And finally, a light dry brush of Administratum Grey as the final kind of highlight. Lastly, I just make sure that the base trim is painted black again using Abaddon Black. So it's a very, very simple base, no grass tufts, no pigments, nothing like that. And it's meant to represent this barren, dark world that is present in the lore of the Night Lords. After putting on some decals, putting together the parts that I'd kept separate for the painting, and varnishing the whole thing with a 50-50 mix of matte and satin varnish, this is what it looks like. It's a relatively quick process to go through, and since the metal base coat kind of helps you with 4 of the main areas of the miniature, you get a lot of work done from those quick first steps. It also pays off if you try to be a little bit careful when you apply the blue colors to the armor panels, so you don't have that much work to touch up the rest afterwards. It's also quite nice not to have to use a metal paint to do all those trims, as doing a contrast paint is much quicker than the standard of metal paint, washing, highlighting, and all of that on all those trims. You could easily adapt this scheme if you want to make any other types of Chaos Space Marines. As you saw in the beginning, they kind of looked like Alpha Legion before we put the Druchii Violet on. So if you keep that original Achillean green base and not even add the Gorgrunta fur contrast, you have an even quicker, even simpler scheme for doing Alpha Legion, for example. And you can, of course, trade out the blue for some sort of red, maybe Flesh Terrors or Blood Angels contrast, to do some sort of Word Bearers or World Eaters. It's a good base for the Iron Warriors too, if you never add any hue to the armor plates and just go directly to the Gorgrunta fur for the different trims. Then you pretty much have your Iron Warriors done. So I hope you found something inspiring about this video, and maybe you could use some of the techniques for your own Chaos Space Marines. Please do consider subscribing or liking the video if you found anything useful here. I'll see you guys next time. Good luck with your miniatures.